Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S IAS Study Circle. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading from our UPSC perspective. Now today we shall discuss the important news which has appeared in the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 18th September 2020. The news to be discussed has been displayed on your screen and timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So on this note, let's start our today's discussion from our examination perspective. The first news to be discussed appears as a lead article on page number 6. It says, "Reject this inequitable climate proposal." The UN Secretary General's recent advice to India amounts to asking for its virtual deindustrialization as well as stagnation, especially during the present economic slowdown caused due to COVID-19. Now, this article highlights that the UN Secretary General has asked India not to make any new investments in coal after 2020. And he has asked India to give up coal so that India can reduce its emission by 45% by 2030. So, according to the article, it says that this speech given by the UN Secretary General deliberately sets aside the foundation principles of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is because this framework distinguishes between commitment and responsibilities of developed countries as well as developing countries. Not only this, the UN Secretary General has also asked India and China to reduce their emission by 45% by 2030 at par with developed countries. So the question which arises is that why the author is saying that the UN Secretary General is not correct when he compares India and China at par with other developed nations. Let us understand these basic concepts as to why emissions by developed and developing nations are considered different based on their historical emissions, as this understanding will also help you in understanding the remaining parts of this article. Now, it's a general understanding that greater or more industrial activity leads to greater emissions, and greater emission leads to warming of the climate. So, the whole question is that who is carrying out more industrial activity in the world and since when? So, there are two aspects here, that which countries are carrying out industrial activities and the time from which these countries are carrying out these industrial activities. So here we can say that industrial activity did not start uniformly across the world, and it started much earlier in the developed countries such as countries of Western Europe as well as US, and it started much later in developing countries, for example India as well as China, even Bangladesh. So the question is that can both these group of countries, that is developed countries and developing countries, can be considered at par, especially with respect to the industrial activity being carried on and also with respect to greater emissions. Now, apart from the fact of timeline, there is another aspect which we must understand, and that is with respect to the scientific or technological development which has taken place in the developed countries as compared to the scientific developments which is currently taking place in the developing countries. So here we see that the developing countries are using more coal as compared to the developed countries. However, the developed countries have been carrying out industrial activities much earlier as compared to the developing countries. So it has been considered that the developing nations where industrial activity started much later should not be equally responsible at par with the developed nations. Now this is with respect to both timeline and also with respect to the scientific developments, as most of the developed countries now are using nuclear energies and using less amount of coal as compared to the developing countries, and we know that use of coal will lead to greater emissions. So it is in this regard that the UN Secretary General has asked India not to make new investment in coal after 2020, and it is here where the authors in this article have said that this demand or this speech by the UN Secretary General deliberately set aside the foundational principles of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So with respect to this difference in emissions made by developing countries as well as developed countries, the Paris Agreement of 2015 agreed for a principle referred as common but differentiated responsibilities. That is, the responsibilities of developed nations would be greater as compared to the developing nation. So here in this context, let us also understand certain basic aspects of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and also the important highlights of Paris Agreement of 2015, so as to understand that why the authors in this article have critiqued this particular speech of United Nations Secretary General, where he has asked India as well as China to reduce their emissions by 45% by 2030 at par with developed countries. Now, overall, UNFCCC provides for limiting greenhouse gas emissions both for developed as well as developing countries. Now, here you need to understand about the greenhouse gases emissions. Now, greenhouse gases can be said to be such gases which traps heat in the atmosphere, because of which the temperature of the atmosphere increases. So these greenhouse gases includes CO2, that is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, fluorinated gases, as well as ozone depleting gases such as CFCs, that is chlorofluorocarbons, hydrofluorocarbons, etc. Now another important aspect with respect to these greenhouse gases is their ability to warm the atmosphere, and this ability to warm the atmosphere is recognized or gauged through their global warming potential of these gases, which is also referred as GWP. So GWP is the global warming potential for these greenhouse gases. Now, global warming potential takes into factor two aspects. First, how long a particular gas remains in the atmosphere. That is, how long a GHG remains in the atmosphere. And second, how strongly any particular GHG absorbs heat or energy in the atmosphere, so that when the energy is trapped by these greenhouse gases, then it remains in the atmosphere. So both these aspects becomes important to find out the global warming potential of these greenhouse gases. So overall we can say that the global warming potential compares warming potential of different gases and also how long they remain in the atmosphere. So according to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is expected from the developed nations to do most on cutting down of emissions. Now, as per the UNFCCC, these developed nations are also referred as Annex 1 countries, or such countries whose name has been provided in the first annexure of the agreement. Further, the agreement also says that industrialized nations agree to provide financial support to developing nations to support climate change activities, and accordingly a system of grants as well as loans under the UNFCCC has been set up and is managed by Global Environment Facility. Now this extract has been taken from the UNFCCC itself. It says that the Global Environment Facility of the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Environment Programme, as well as International Bank for Reconstruction and Development shall be the international entity entrusted with the operation of the financial mechanism. And in this connection, the Global Environment Facility should be appropriately restructured. So here we understand that Global Environment Facility becomes the mechanism which manages the grants as well as loans provided from the developed and industrialized nations to the developing countries. Now, some of the important aspects highlighted at the beginning of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change includes the fact that it acknowledges the change in Earth's climate and its adverse effects, which are a common concern for humankind. It further says that it is concerned that human activities have been substantially increasing the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, that the increase in this greenhouse gas enhance the natural greenhouse effect, that is trapping of heat by these gases in the atmosphere. And this trapping of heat by these gases in the atmosphere will result on average in an additional warming of the Earth's surface as well as atmosphere, and this overall may adversely affect natural ecosystems and humankind. So these aspects with respect to the natural greenhouse effect of GHGs becomes very important. Another important aspect highlighted here is that it says that noting that the largest share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases has originated in the developed countries, that per capita emission in developing countries are still relatively low. Now this is a very important aspect which has been clearly stated in United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the very onset. It highlights or it states that the per capita emission in developing countries are still relatively low, and the share of global emission originating in developing countries will grow to meet their social and developmental needs. So the convention says that the developing countries also have a right to meet their social as well as developmental needs based on their low per capita emissions in the past. Further, it also highlights about the role and importance in terrestrial and marine ecosystem of sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. So these can be said to be some of the important highlights which has been provided at the very onset or at the very beginning of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, based on UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in December 1997. However, it entered into force in February 2005. Now here few points you must know about Kyoto Protocol, as well as questions can also be asked on Kyoto Protocol. Now it says that Kyoto Protocol operationalizes the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by committing industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gases emissions in accordance with agreed individual targets. It further says that the Kyoto Protocol is based on the principles and provisions of the convention and also follows an annex based structure. That is, there are certain countries which have been provided in one of the annexures of Kyoto Protocol. It says that it only binds developed countries and places a heavier burden on such developed countries under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respected capabilities. Now this principle is very important because it differentiates the developed and developing countries based on their historical emissions. As it says that it recognizes that the developed countries are largely responsible for current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Now with respect to its annex based structure, the Kyoto Protocol has provided for an annexure B. It says that under its Annexure B, the Kyoto Protocol sets binding emission reduction targets for 37 industrialized countries and economies in transition, including the European Union. So here it's also important to understand the Kyoto Protocol along with the UNFCCC, as the Kyoto Protocol provides for heavier burden on the developed nations under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respected capabilities. Now moving on from Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement of 2015. Now another very important point to be understood here is that the Paris Agreement is supposed to overtake the Kyoto Protocol. Now the Paris Agreement of 2015 becomes very important even for your upcoming prelims examination on 4th October 2020. It says that it has been built upon the convention, that is UNFCCC, and for the first time brings all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects with enhanced support to assist developing countries. So again the talk is here with respect to helping the developing countries by developed and industrialized nations. Now another very important aspect highlighted here is that the Paris Agreement central aim is to strengthen the global response to threat of climate change by keeping the global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, and also to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. That is, not to allow increase in temperature above 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at the max to keep the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. Another important aspect highlighted here is with respect to nationally determined contributions. It says that the Paris Agreement requires all parties to put forward their best efforts through nationally determined contributions and also to strengthen these efforts in the years ahead. And here it includes requirements that all parties report regularly on their emissions and also on their implementation efforts. Further, the agreement also prescribes that parties shall communicate their nationally determined contributions every 5 years and provide information necessary for clarity and transparency. Further, the Paris Agreement also reaffirms the obligations of developed countries to support the efforts of developing country parties to build clean as well as climate resilient futures. And the agreement also provides for a financial mechanism including the Green Climate Fund. So these can be said to be some of the important aspects which you must know with respect to UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol as well as Paris Agreement. Now understanding the basics of UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol as well as Paris Agreement will not only help us to understand the views of the authors in this article but will also help us to solve previous UPSC questions asked in the prelims examination. Now as you can see, these two questions were asked in 2016 whereas this particular question was asked 2014. The question asked in 2016 was, the term intended nationally determined contributions is sometimes seen in the news in the context of. Options were pledges made by European countries to rehabilitate refugees from the war affected Middle East, plan of action outlined by countries of world to combat climate change, capital contributed by the member countries in the establishment of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and plan of action outlined by the countries of world regarding sustainable development goals. In this, the correct answer is B, that is plan of action outlined by the countries of world to combat climate change. Now let us look at this particular question. It says that with reference to the agreement at UNFCCC meeting in Paris in 2015, that is the Paris Agreement, which of the following statements are correct? First, the agreement was signed by all the member countries of the UN and it will go into effect in 2017. No, incorrect. Second, the agreement aims to limit the greenhouse gas emissions so that the rise in average global temperature by the end of this century does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Yes, this is correct. And this aspect we have just highlighted here in our discussion. Third, it says that developed countries acknowledged their historical responsibility in global warming and committed to donate $1,000 billion a year from 2020 to help developing countries to cope with climate change. No, this is also incorrect. So here the correct answer was B, that is 2 only. Now coming to this question asked in the year 2014, the question was, with reference to Global Environment Facility, which one of the following statements are correct? A. It serves as financial mechanism for Convention on Biological Diversity and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. B. It undertakes scientific research on environmental issues at global level. No, this is incorrect. C. It is an agency under OECD to facilitate the transfer of technology and funds to underdeveloped countries with specific aim to protect their environment. And D. Both A and B. In this, the correct answer was A. Further, this particular question was also asked in the year 2016. It says, consider the following pairs. Terms sometimes seen in the news, their origin. Now look at the terms provided by UPSC. Annex 1 countries. Now we have already discussed about Annex 1 countries with respect to United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. So this pairing is incorrect. Second, certified emissions reductions, Nagoya Protocol. Now again we have to know about certified emissions reductions as well as clean developmental mechanisms. So the clean developmental mechanism is with respect to the Kyoto Protocol. It says that it is defined in Article 12 of the protocol and allows a country with an emission reduction or emission limitation commitment under the Kyoto Protocol, and this is done to implement an emission reduction project in developing countries. As such project can earn saleable certified emission reduction credits, each equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. These credits can be traded and sold and also used by industrialized countries to meet a part of their emission reduction targets under Kyoto Protocol. It says that the mechanism stimulates sustainable development and emission reductions while giving industrialized countries some flexibility in how they meet their emission reduction limitation targets. It further says that the CDM, that is Clean Developmental Mechanism, is the main source of income of UNFCCC Adaptation Fund, which was established to finance adaptation projects and programs in developing countries which are parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and such countries which are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. It further says that the adaptation fund is financed by a 2% levy on CERs issued by CDM. So in this regard, the second option also becomes incorrect and only the third option was correct. So here the correct answer was C. Now with respect to Cartagena Protocol, it's a protocol on biosafety to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it basically deals with ensuring and safe handling as well as transport and use of living modified organisms. Whereas the Nagoya Protocol, it is with respect to access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the point to be understood here is that UPSC is not only asking about UNFCCC or Kyoto Protocol, but they are going a step ahead and also asking about Annex 1 countries and also certain aspects related to Kyoto Protocol. So after understanding these basics, let us go through the viewpoints of the author as highlighted in this particular article. Now the author in this article has highlighted that India is one of the few countries which is on track to fulfill the UNFCCC requirement. And it says that India is also on a much smaller list of such country which is also on track to fulfill their Paris Agreement commitments. And this is especially with respect to the 2 degrees Celsius aspect. Another point highlighted here is that India's annual emission is much below as compared to the Annex 1 countries or as compared to the developed countries. So this article says that despite accelerated economic growth in India for the past few years, India's annual emissions at 0.5 tons per capita is well below the global average of 1.3 tons per capita. And also India's annual emission is well below as compared to China, US as well as European Union, which are the 3 leading emitters in absolute terms whose per capita emissions are higher than this particular average. That is the average emission of 1.3 tons per capita. Further, with respect to cumulative emissions as well, the article says that India's cumulative emission is much below as compared to European Unions. It says that India's contribution by 2017 was only 4% for a higher population of 1.3 billion as compared to European Union, whose population is mere 448 million, however is responsible for 20% of cumulative emissions. Further, the article says that even as per UNFCCC, reduction of annual emission by developed countries is far too less. It says the UNFCCC has itself reported that between 1990 and 2017, the developed nations excluding Russia and Eastern Europe have reduced their annual emissions by only 1.3%. And according to the authors, this reduction of 1.3% amounts to practically no reduction at all. Further, the author says that the UNFCCC does not provide for any timeline with respect to phasing out oil and natural gas, which is mostly used by developed countries, as according to the author, both oil as well as natural gas are fossil fuels. So the author says that the report mentions about phasing out of coal, but no timeline has been provided for phasing out oil and natural gas, which is currently used by developed nations. And in this article, the developed nations has been referred as the global north. Further, the article says that talk of carbon neutrality is of no use unless developed nations reduce their annual emission. Now here, carbon neutrality refers to or means having a balance between emission of carbon and also absorption of carbon from the atmosphere in carbon sinks. Now carbon sinks can be forest, oceans, etc. So with respect to carbon neutrality, it means the amount of carbon dioxide which is emitted must be absorbed through the carbon sinks, including forest as well as marine ecosystem. So overall we can say that carbon sink is any system that absorbs more carbon than it emits, and the main natural carbon sinks are soil, forest and oceans. So it highlights that removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then storing it is known as carbon sequestration. And in order to achieve this net zero emission, all worldwide greenhouse gas emissions will have to be counterbalanced by carbon sequestration. That is, the amount of CO2 which is released in the atmosphere has to be absorbed in the carbon sink, or rather has to be removed from the atmosphere and absorbed in the carbon sink. And it is here where the mention of net zero emission comes into picture, as the article says that in order to achieve net zero emission, all worldwide greenhouse gas emissions will have to be counterbalanced by carbon sequestration. That is, the amount of CO2 released in the atmosphere must be absorbed in the carbon sink. So with respect to the aspect of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, the author says that such future commitment is of no use unless present actions is taken by the developed countries. So article says that any talk on carbon neutrality without doing any actual groundwork and declaring climate emergency is just model talking without doing actually what is required. Now, after discussing about the fact that developed countries are not doing much with respect to achieving the Paris Agreement targets, the author then mentions about the fact that what could be the likely scenario if coal investment is actually paused. So the author says that currently roughly 2 gigawatt of coal-based generation is being decommissioned per year. And this implies that by 2030, India will have only 184 gigawatts of coal-based generation. But the question is that if coal investment is stopped completely, then how will we produce electricity? Because in production of electricity, substantial amount of coal is used. Now here the author says that if coal is not used with respect to electricity production, then by the year 2030, especially with respect to the current electricity demand, we will require roughly around 650 gigawatt to 750 gigawatt of renewable energy to produce electricity. Now here the author says that unlike developed countries, India cannot substitute coal substantially by oil and gas, and despite some wind potential, huge part of this growth has to come from solar energy. However, the author also says that renewable energy can maximum meet residential consumption or residential requirements, including at the max service sector requirement. So, requirement of manufacturing has to be met through coal. So the author says that renewable energy cannot drive manufacturing industry, as the manufacturing industry will require investment with respect to coal. Further, the author says that manufacturing growth powered by fossil fuel, that is coal, is itself a necessity for transitioning to renewable energy, both in terms of economy as well as technology. And overall, providing 70 to 80% of all generation capacity through renewable energy will depend critically on technological development in India. That is, how much technological development we are able to achieve so that we can rely 70 to 80% of our production capacity through renewable energy. And this will also include improvements in the efficiency of conversion of energy from its source into electricity. Basically, the improvement with respect to efficiency of renewable energy. So these are the likely scenarios which the author has highlighted if investment in coal is completely paused. So overall, the author concludes by saying that accepting United Nations Secretary General advice will lead to virtual deindustrialization for India, especially in the present circumstances. The 4 points highlighted here are: first, it will increase India's dependence. Now here the author says that India as of now lacks capacity with respect to renewable energy technologies. And if India is supposed to use only renewable energy technology, then it will expose India to increasing and severe dependence on external sources. That is, India will have to depend on external sources for its manufacturing ability as well as supply chains. Further, the author says that coal along with renewable energy, that is, use of coal along with renewable energy, will generate directly and indirectly more employment opportunities as compared to using only renewable energy. Third, the author says that advice of UN Secretary General will lead to virtual deindustrialization. Now here there are two aspects. First, if India stops investment in coal after 2020, and second, if India is able to implement 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, then according to the authors, this will virtually lead to deindustrialization of India. And it will also impact India's economy, as India's economy will be trapped in a low developmental phase. And lastly, the authors have said that India must unanimously reject UN Secretary General's calls and recreate long-standing commitment to an equitable response to the challenge of climate change. Now here equitable response refers to common but differentiated responsibility. That is, the developed nation cannot ask the developing nation to pay back in the same coin, considering the historical emissions done by the developed countries. Thus, this article becomes extremely important from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination. Now, this topic becomes important both from the perspective of prelims as well as from the perspective of mains. From your mains, it gets covered under GS paper 3, especially with respect to aspects of Indian economy as well as environment. And in your prelims, it gets covered under general issues on environmental ecology, biodiversity, and climate change, and also with respect to economic and social development. So, after discussing this very important article, let's move on to the next news discussion. The next news appears as an editorial on page number 6. It says, "A push for reform. The United Nations must change to reflect the altered geopolitical realities in order to stay relevant." Now, this editorial highlights about the need for reform of the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Councils, as well as the veto power given to the 5 permanent members, namely the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, as well as China, also referred as P5 or Permanent 5. And this expansion of United Nations Security Council is propounded through the G4 countries, which includes India, Germany, Japan, and Brazil. Now, this becomes important from your upcoming prelims examination, especially with respect to expansion of United Nations Security Council. The G4 countries also becomes important because recently India has been elected as a non-permanent member of United Nations Security Council in June 2020. Now, another important aspect highlighted in this editorial, which becomes important from our examination point of view, is with respect to the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of Security Council and related matters. Now, with respect to intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on an increase in membership of Security Council, the news says that the General Assembly's 102nd plenary meeting in 2008 decided to facilitate the reform process through the intergovernmental negotiations framework on equitable representation as well as expansion of United Nations Security Council. So if a question is asked in your prelims examination with respect to intergovernmental negotiations framework on equitable representation, then you must know that it is with respect to expansion of United Nations Security Council. And the IGN dealt with issues of category of membership, the question of the veto, regional representation, size of an enlarged Security Council, and working methods of the Council, and also the relationship between Council and the General Assembly. Now, with respect to IGN, the news says that it was adopted by UN in 2015, however was not supported by United States, Russia as well as China, as they opposed any serious reform made to United Nations Security Council. So, with respect to IGN, this editorial basically highlights about the need to reform the United Nations Security Council considering the present reality. And the present reality is with respect to a changed political and economic structure post World War II and especially after the Cold War. And it is here where the editorial says that the United Nations still does not reflect present reality. Now, we have already seen that the P5 countries does not want any serious reform in the Security Council, and these P5 countries are even willing to discard rules laid down through the UN Charter. So it is in this regard this article concludes by saying that all countries must have equal voice to determine their future acts, and it is only when all countries will have equal vote then the United Nations will be more democratic as well as representative. So in this editorial, you must know about the G4 countries as well as about IGN, that is Intergovernmental Negotiation on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of Security Council and related matters. And this editorial becomes important from the perspective of GS paper 2, especially with respect to international relations, and in your prelims gets covered under current events of international importance. With this, let's move on to our next news of discussion. Now, the next article to be discussed appears on page number 7 as an interview. It says that is the Quad rising after China's challenge at the LAC? So this article effectively says that will Quad help in solving India's problem with China at LAC or at the border issues. So the question is that whether a maritime alliance with respect to Quad will help in solving the border tensions which India and China are currently facing at LAC. So in this regard, let us go through the highlights of the viewpoints expressed by both the authors in this particular interview. Now, as we all know that Quad comprises of United States, India, Japan as well as Australia. And Quad in the present time is a maritime coalition in the Indo-Pacific region, as you can see in this particular map. So in the present context with respect to India-China standoff along the LAC, Quad is being considered as a coalition of the willing to deter China in the Indo-Pacific region. So the LAC standoff with India along the border is very different as compared to the coalition of the willing to deter China in the Indo-Pacific region. An overall article says that India's participation with respect to Quad has not deterred China. Rather, China has been assertive in the last 6 or more months, not only with India, but also with other countries including Japan as well as Philippines and even Australia. So there are two primary questions which becomes important in this discussion. First, how does Quad enhances India's capability? And second is that what does Quad expects in return from India? That is, what is the coalition including United States, Australia as well as Japan expects in return from India? Now, as we have already highlighted about the maritime coalition of Quad, and it is here where United States expects India's participation and presence not only in the Indian Ocean region but also around the South China Sea. So it is in this regard this article or this interview highlights that India's presence in the Quad must be seen especially with respect to the changing India-China dynamics. So coming back to the first question as to how Quad enhances India's capabilities. First, it says that Quad can fill the gap between India and China, especially the fact that Quad has Australia, United States as well as Japan. And this filling of gap between India and China is only with respect to maritime domain and not with respect to the border standoff along LAC. The second point highlighted here is that Quad might not help India in the continental challenge, that is along the borders or LAC. Maximum what Quad can provide us is with respect to intelligence or certain hardware support, but it will not directly involve between bilateral problems between India and China along the LAC or along the border. So it is clear that Quad will only help India in the maritime domain. So this brings us to the second question as to what Quad expects in return from India. First is with respect to balance of power, and second is with respect to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region, as United States would want India's participation and presence in the Indian Ocean region including the South China Sea. So it is here where members of Quad need to increase their areas of cooperation. This news says that Quad countries can increase their area of cooperation and even include more countries in the future, and here they have referred a term known as Quad Plus. The areas in which they can increase their cooperation includes disaster relief, various aspects of technology including artificial intelligence, 5G, cyber security, etc., as well as trade. And this is important because present achievements through Quad, especially for India, is limited, as Quad as of now is in itself a work in progress. Now, since India is not only a member of Quad but also a member of SCO, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, RIC Trilateral, that is Russia, India, China Trilateral, as well as BRICS. So here the interview highlights that becoming a part of different multilateral engagements or platform helps in balancing India's interest, and it also increases India's proactive engagement at different forums, both at the level of strategy as well as at the level of flexibility. Further, engagement of India along RIC and BRICS also keeps Russia on India's side. And also the fact that these platforms should not be left solely for Pakistan and China, who are India's rivals. Further, these different platforms provides opportunity to manage contradictions with the rivals including China as well as Pakistan. And it is here where both strategy and flexibility becomes handy with respect to India's approach. Now, lastly, this interview highlights about two important aspects. First is the fact that Quad members do not in themselves have any inherent disputes or contradictions, whereas India-US relation may spoil India-Russia relations, especially with respect to the missile S-400 system. So it is here where this interview highlights about the need for strategy and flexibility while participating at these different multilateral forums. Thus, this news becomes important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, especially with respect to international relations, and from your prelims perspective, it gets covered under current events of international importance, especially with respect to Quad. With this, let's move on to our next news discussion. The next news to be discussed appears on page number 10 as well as on page number 11. The news on page number 10 says, United States keen on finalising BECA at 2+2 dialogue. Maritime Information Agreement is also under active consideration. Whereas this news on page number 11 says that United States to strengthen relationship with India. Top US official says China's recent action on LAC reinforce US-India strategic partnership. Now both these news becomes important both from our prelims as well as mains perspective. As in your upcoming prelims, questions on BECA as well as 2+2 dialogue can be asked. Whereas with respect to your mains, a question can be framed especially with respect to India-US strategic partnership considering an assertive China which we have just seen in the previous news. So this news on page number 11 highlights the growing India-US closer ties, especially on the backdrop of India-China problems along the LAC. And it is based on these problems between India and China, especially along their borders, United States is planning to develop a closer tie with India. Now here the United States has mentioned a very important aspect, especially with respect to cooperation and sharing of burden. Now here the US official has said that India and US should focus on the issue where there are converging interests and operationalize their cooperation around those specific issues and accept that there will be policy differences between them on other issues. So this brings us to the point which we discussed in some of the previous articles, especially with respect to India and United States. Now in one of the previous articles it was provided that rather than going for an alliance, both India and United States should rather consider their relationship as that of a joint agreement or a joint venture. And based on this joint venture, this article says that there can be certain issues of common interest which can be found, based on which both countries can converge their interest and operationalize their cooperation with respect to those strategic issues or such issues where both India and US converge. So with respect to this cooperation and sharing of burden, the US officials said that cooperation and burden sharing was becoming inevitable, not only in the military and maritime areas, but also in terms of economies, countering the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. Now this is a very important aspect highlighted in this news, especially with respect to countering the Belt and Road Initiative through cooperation and also sharing of burden. Now it is here where the United States want to cooperate with India on certain vested interests and also wants India to share certain burden, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, as we have just discussed. Now this news also highlights that India welcomed the agreement signed between United States and Maldives. Now as per the agreement it states that the framework states both countries, that is US and Maldives, intend to deepen their engagement and cooperation in support of maintaining peace and security in the Indian Ocean, and this marks an important step forward in the defense partnership between US and Maldives. So again India has welcomed this particular step, considering the location of Maldives in the Indian Ocean region. Now based on this backdrop of a growing closer ties between United States and India, the US is keen on finalizing the BECA at 2+2 dialogue. Now here you need to know about BECA as well as 2+2 dialogue. Now 2+2 dialogue is with respect to the dialogue between foreign ministers and defense ministers of both India and United States. So in this news it says that United States is keen that India sign the last foundational agreement, that is BECA, which is Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Cooperation. And the United States want this to be done at the next India U.S. 2+2 Ministerial Dialogue, which is likely to be held in October 2020. So in this regard you need to know about the 4 foundational agreements. Basically, LEMOA, that is Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, that is COMCASA, General Security of Military Information Agreement, that is GSOMIA, which was signed in 2002. Further, you also need to know about Industrial Security Annex, which is an extension of GSOMIA, as it was signed at the last 2+2 dialogue. So GSOMIA refers to General Security of Military Information Agreement, and it is an agreement signed to safeguard the information that is shared during technology transfer. Now, India and United States GSOMIA allows exchange of classified information about military technologies between the entities of the government of India and US. Further, signing of ISA enabled greater industry to industry collaborations between India and United States. Now, LEMOA was signed in 2016 and it stands for Logistic Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. Further, it is a facilitating agreement that establishes basic terms, conditions, and procedures for reciprocal provision of logistic support, supplies, and services between the armed forces of India and United States. As per LEMOA, reciprocal logistic support would be used exclusively during authorized port visits, joint exercises, joint trainings, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. Further, COMCASA stands for Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. Now, COMCASA permits Indian military to function on high-end secured and encrypted communication equipment which are installed on American platforms obtained by Indian Air Forces. Now, these platforms include C-130J, C-17, P-8L aircraft, and Apache and Chinook helicopters. So, this facilitates greater interoperability between forces and military hardware of India and United States, and also possibly with other countries which operates on US origin platforms. And lastly, about BECA, which United States is keen to sign in the upcoming 2+2 ministerial dialogue between India and United States. It stands for Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Cooperation. Now, BECA is the last of the 4 foundational agreements that underpin deepening defense cooperation between the two countries. Now, with respect to deepening defense cooperation, BECA will enable sharing of geospatial and satellite data, and US wants BECA to be signed at the Ministerial 2+2 dialogue in October 2020. So, these are some of the important terms which you need to know, especially with respect to India-US defense cooperation, that is about LEMOA, COMCASA, GSOMIA, ISA, as well as BECA. Now, both these articles forms part of international relations under GS paper 2, and in your prelims gets covered under current events of international importance. The next news to be discussed appears on page number 5. It says, wetlands being identified in Rajasthan to protect biodiversity. No waste would be allowed to be dumped in such wetlands. Now, with respect to this particular news, you need to know about Sambhar Lake as it has been provided in this particular news. So, Sambhar Lake is primarily a salt lake which is in Rajasthan. And also you need to know about wetlands. So, with respect to wetland, it highlights that wetland is a place where land is covered by water, either salt water or fresh water or somewhere in between. And the examples of wetland includes marshes and ponds, edge of a lake or ocean, delta at the mouth of a river, low-lying areas that frequently flood. So, all these can be said to be wetlands. Further, it says that destruction of wetlands is a concern because they are some of the most productive habitats on planet. And these wetlands often support high concentration of animals including mammals, birds, fish and invertebrates, and also serve as nurseries for many of these species. Further, wetlands also support the cultivation of rice, which is a staple diet in half of world's population. And also wetland provides a range of ecosystem services that benefit humanity including water filtration, storm protection, flood control as well as recreation. So these can be said to be some of the important aspects with respect to wetland. Last news to be discussed appears on page number 14. It says Pakistan to make Gilgit-Baltistan a full-fledged province as per the report. Imran Khan to make announcement during his visit to the region. Now, with respect to this particular news, you need to know about the location of Gilgit-Baltistan. So, in this regard, this news says that Pakistan has decided to elevate Gilgit-Baltistan's status to that of a full-fledged province or a state. Now, Gilgit-Baltistan would be given adequate representation on all constitutional bodies, including the National Assembly and Senate in Pakistan. Now, another important point which we need to know is with respect to the work done on Mokponda Special Economic Zone, which would begin under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And this Mokponda Special Economic Zone is located somewhere here in the Gilgit-Baltistan region. It further says that a CPEC, which connects Gwadar port in Pakistan's Balochistan with China's Xinjiang province, is the flagship project of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. It further says that CPEC is a collection of infrastructure and other projects under construction throughout Pakistan since 2013. And in this regard, India has clearly conveyed to Pakistan that the entire union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, including the areas of Gilgit and Baltistan, are an integral part of the country by virtue of its fully legal and irrevocable accession. Government of India further says that Government of Pakistan or its judiciary has no locus standi or right on territories illegally and forcibly occupied by Pakistan. Further, India completely rejects such actions and continued attempts of Pakistan to bring material changes in their political map, especially highlighting occupied areas of Indian territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Further, Government of India said that Pakistan should immediately vacate all areas under its illegal occupation. So this is India's stand with respect to Pakistan, which is about to make Gilgit-Baltistan a full-fledged province. As you can see in this map, the entire area of Gilgit-Baltistan comes under the territory of Union of India. So this news becomes important primarily from the perspective of current events of international importance and also with respect to location of Gilgit-Baltistan and also with respect to location of Mokponda Special Economic Zone, which would begin under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, based on our discussion, this becomes your practice question for the day. The question is, Government of India has not signed which of the following so far with United States? Options are A. LEMOA, B. BECA, C. COMCASA, and D. GSOMIA. Now, coming to the answer of yesterday, the question was with reference to National Agricultural Market, that is ENAM. Consider the following statements. First, ENAM is a pan-Indian electronic trading portal to create a unified national market for agricultural commodities. Yes, this is correct. Second, NABARD is the lead agency for implementing ENAM. No, this is incorrect as the correct answer is Small Farmers Agri-Business Consortium. So here the question was which of the following statements given above is are correct. So the correct answer here was A, that is one only. So with this we come to an end to today's discussion. Thank you.